Hello everyone, how are you today? My name is Elizabeth Willett, Senior Fertility Herbalist with the Natural Fertility Company. We are the naturalfertilityshop.com and naturalfertilityinfo.com. Welcome to everyone who's joining live, and thank you to all replay viewers who will watch later on. I'm glad you're here today. So today we're going to jump right in and talk about fertility health and go back to the basics. There's a reason for this. We've had some questions lately that have really resonated with me and made me understand that there are a lot of women who aren't in an intimate relationship with their menstrual cycle. And what I mean by that is that they don't understand it at all. Perhaps nothing more than that they get a period every month and don't understand the intricacies of what else happens throughout the cycle that it needs to happen in order for natural conception to even be a possibility. So we're going to go back to the basics and talk about the menstrual cycle. So this morning I was listening to a podcast, an interview between two practitioners, one that I follow pretty frequently named Nat Kay. I can't say her last name. She lives in Melbourne, Australia. She's a naturopathic, a doctor, a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine, and she said something that made me literally screech out, yes, this! I just wanted to shout it to the world, but I'm in my little office by myself, so I'll share it with you. Fertility is not just about babies. Fertility is about having a thriving reproductive system, so if and when the time is right for you to conceive, you're ready to go. Quote unquote Nat Kay. I thought that was amazing, and I really think that step one of taking charge of your fertility is really getting to know your menstrual cycle intimately. If you haven't heard about the book, Taking Charge of Your Fertility by Toni Weschler, I would suggest checking it out. But taking charge of your fertility is understanding your menstrual cycle intimately. What happens when and why throughout the month so that you can understand or know your optimal time for trying to conceive, if that's your choice, if and when you're ready to try to do that. So I really think that women in their menstrual cycle should have a close relationship. Hello, welcome. If you've landed here on this video and my talk, or the Natural Fertility Shop websites, you probably have an intimate understanding of your menstrual cycle, but maybe not. You know what? It's not always the case. We receive emails pretty frequently from women who don't quite understand what's going on, have been trying to conceive for years even and don't know when they ovulate. And that is just a tiny bit concerning. You know, we find that young girls in schools are educated about their periods, how it happens, and then sexually transmitted diseases. They're told how to handle bleeding and cramps with over-the-counter things like ibuprofen and Midol and tampons and pads, and then they're kind of sent on their way, and that's about it. And there's so much more to it than that. So let's just dive right in. You know, this video is really bare bones. It's a bare bones refresher of the menstrual cycle, the cycle, as many call it, and the events that happen during it, a little bit about hormones and about anatomy too. So the menstrual cycle, when we say the terms menstrual cycle or the cycle, we refer to this time frame where it's usually about a month. It can be very different for everybody, but it's from the first day of your period until the first day of your next period. That's the entire cycle. It's going to be most likely many days. It should be around 28 days. For some women, it's longer. It can be 28, it can be 30, it can be 31, it could maybe even be 35 and be completely normal. Depends upon what else you have going on. So the menstrual cycle, the entire thing, is from your period day one until the next time you get your period, that first day of your next period. A typical cycle, like I said, lasts about 20 days. We know that differs for everyone. Just because yours is a teeny bit shorter or a teeny bit longer doesn't mean there's a problem or that you're infertile by any means. We look at a lot of different factors to determine whether or not your cycle is normal for you. Your normal is not going to be mine, and mine is not going to be hers. Just remember that. So next, I have a line. I hope that it makes sense as I go through, but the menstrual cycle obviously starts with bleeding. That's your period. If someone says the cycle, uses the term cycle and period interchangeably, I always get confused because I think of the cycle as that entire time frame, that whole month or a little bit longer. And I think of period as menstruation or menstrual period. Those are three more interchangeable terms. And during a period, the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus, the endometrial lining is what is shed. It turns into aunt flow. So period, menstrual period, and aunt flow, or AF, you may see it abbreviated, are all interchangeable terms. Period and cycle, in my mind, and from my education, aren't interchangeable. I just kind of want to make that clear. So during your period or aunt flow, the endometrial lining, the lining of the uterus, is what is shed. This happens in the follicular phase of the cycle, that whole entire time frame. The follicular phase is from the first day of your period until ovulation. It's typically about a 2-week time frame. It'll vary for everyone, but roughly 12 to 14 days. And during this time, the ovary is producing estrogen, recruiting and selecting an egg to be ovulated, and the follicle from which the egg is going to ovulate, if ovulation happens, is growing too. So the follicular phase, again, just to recap, is from the first day of your period until ovulation. That time frame should be roughly 12 to 14 days. And during this time, the ovary is producing estrogen. It's choosing an egg to help grow and mature, and it's growing the follicle from which the egg will ovulate out of. That all happens in the follicular phase. Luteinizing hormone is the hormone that rises during the follicular phase as well, before ovulation. OPKs, or ovulation predictor kits or test strips, measure LH to help determine when you're about to ovulate. But the thing about OPKs to always know and to keep in mind is that they don't guarantee ovulation will occur, does occur, or will occur at the same time each cycle. They're just giving you an indicator that LH is beginning to rise, and hopefully ovulation will happen. If some of you experience anovulation, you know that sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes ovulation doesn't happen and things like ovarian cysts form. There are lots of different events that can happen there, but that LH surge happens in the follicular phase as well. Cervical mucus is another thing that you're going to notice as you travel through the follicular phase. Cervical mucus can also be referred to as cervical fluid. This is the fluid or mucus that's produced by the cervix to give you an idea that ovulation is about to happen and hopefully help sperm travel to an egg easier. This fluid can help with dryness, vaginal dryness, but it's not the same as vaginal secretions that happen when your libido is cranking and you're having intercourse. They're not quite the same. But cervical mucus, or CM for short, is the substance that you see come out of your vagina as you near ovulation. It's the stuff that makes you wet down there. I know that's kind of something really interesting to talk about live, but anyway, it happens. It's supposed to happen. It's an indicator. The more you see externally, hopefully is an indicator that ovulation is coming or imminent. There are different types of cervical mucus. So when you're on your period, you probably won't see it. Some people do see some mucus while they're on their period. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong. And cervical mucus will be a bit more dry after menstruation, but it'll start to get wetter, more pliable, more liquidy, kind of more like egg whites. You may have heard the term egg white cervical mucus. That'll happen as you near ovulation. And then shortly after, it goes back more to that dry, less stretchy, perhaps not even noticeable at all outside of you state after ovulation occurs. And it's cyclical, so it changes too throughout that cycle. So think of egg white CM, cervical mucus, as you near ovulation. It indicates ovulation's approaching. And it will change too throughout your cycle. So monitoring your cervical mucus is something that's really important to do when you're trying to conceive. Again, mid-cycle or halfway through the cycle, your CM will become that more liquid, clear, stretchy like egg whites, and that's an indicator of ovulation. So if you're charting your basal body temperature, which I'll touch on a little bit later, you should also be paying attention to the cervical mucus that you see. Now next, before we talk about ovulation, I want to touch on the fertile window. This is part that sometimes women don't know, which is surprising to me because this is the time when you have a chance to conceive naturally. So the fertile window is sometimes referred to the ovulatory window. It's the time around ovulation, the days around ovulation, which you can naturally conceive. It's roughly 5 days. So the 3 days before ovulation, your day of ovulation, and even the day after, some people say. And this is because, this is for a couple of reasons why there's a 5-day window. Because sperm can live in the female reproductive tract for roughly 4 days. Some resources say 3 and some say 5. So I kind of estimated there, but roughly 4 days is what I found is common. Sperm can live in the female reproductive system for roughly 4 days. You ovulate, and then the egg lives for 24 hours. So you've got a rough 5-day window there. The most important time to try to conceive, having unprotected intercourse, of course, when that time for you is right, is to have intercourse those days before ovulation and day of, most certainly. And if you can, the day after, just kind of as insurance maybe. So anyway, your fertile window includes ovulation. Ovulation is the time when the dominant follicle that the ovary has recruited an egg for, the follicle has grown to, remember that happened during the follicular phase, actually bursts open, releasing the egg into you, and it's ready to be grabbed by the fimbriae, which is this tiny little hand-like structure at the end of a fallopian tube, not as big as my arm at all, I mean super tiny. But we'll grab that egg and help it travel through the fallopian tube to reach the sperm that's hopefully waiting there. So ovulation typically happens mid-cycle. It should happen then. Some women ovulate later in the cycle, but what's seemingly most important, most experts say, is to have at least a 12-day luteal phase, which is the phase of your menstrual cycle that happens after ovulation. Before I get into the luteal phase, let's talk a little bit more about the fallopian tubes. I'm sure many of you know this. This is probably not a new anatomy lesson. But after the ovaries ovulate, they sit on the sides of your uterus. It's a tiny little pear-shaped organ. It's really not that big at all, sitting down low in your pelvic cavity. There's a tiny little almond-shaped ovary here, and it bursts in ovulation. The follicle bursts and releases an egg in ovulation, and waiting there is this tiny little hand-like structure that moves. It moves, and it's waiting to grab onto that egg. And once it does that, it helps move the egg through the fallopian tube back to the uterus. And it's actually in the fallopian tube that's only about the size of a spaghetti noodle, believe it or not, that the egg and sperm will meet and join, and the embryo is formed. This happens in the tube before it's receiving any nutrients from the mother at all. And then they travel together as one to implant in the uterus. And if that happens properly and conditions are right, it should, pregnancy is a result. The time frame from which egg and sperm meet until traveling through the tube all the way to the uterus to implant is 6 to 10 days, roughly 2 weeks. That's what the 2-week wait, or TWW, you'll see abbreviated, means, the 2-week wait. That's when a woman knows she ovulates, has unprotected intercourse during her fertile window or her ovulatory window, and then she just sits and waits, twiddling, worrying probably, but hopefully not, but wondering mostly if conception did happen in that fallopian tube and the embryo is making its way to the uterus. So anyway, that's the purpose of the fallopian tubes, and hopefully if they're healthy, they'll grab onto the egg and help it travel to meet the sperm before implantation. So now back to the luteal phase. This 2-week wait, or TWW, this roughly 12-day time frame, is the luteal phase. From when ovulation happens until the first day of your next period, the first day of bleeding. Then the whole cycle starts over again. But the luteal phase consists of a time when the egg is ovulated and released, And then progesterone is produced by the body, and the corpus luteum, which is the remaining egg sac from where the egg was ovulated, to prepare the uterus for implantation of a fertilized egg. So progesterone production starts here, and it's a key hormone involved in the menstrual cycle for a proper luteal phase length, but also for preparing the uterine lining, or that endometrial lining that we talked about in the beginning, to become the proper thickness to implant an embryo. If conception didn't happen and there's no embryo to implant, or embryo does not implant, the progesterone levels will drop and your period will start again. This luteal phase, like I said, should be around 12 days. Some are 11, some are a little bit longer, and that's okay. That doesn't indicate there's anything wrong with your cycle or you're infertile necessarily, but it should be about that proper length. And now about basal body temperature. I touched on this just a little bit ago, but your basal body temperature, or your BBT, you'll see it abbreviated, is what you chart if you're doing fertility charting. It's your temperature after you slept straight for at least 5 hours. And it's used to track your cycle, to track the phases of your cycle. You can see your temperature shift. If you track it with some charting technologies like Fertility Friend, for example, you can actually keep track of your cervical mucus. You can keep track of a whole bunch of things, but you'll see when ovulation happens, and you can see a temperature jump, indicating that progesterone's being produced. And you can see if pregnancy occurs, or you can see if your period starts again at the end of your chart. I encourage you to get to know basal body temperature charting if you haven't done that already. This basal body temperature charting is also a way for practitioners to help you understand if there's a fertility health issue. A lot of those are indicated in temp spikes, dips and highs, or not having one at all. There are times when BBT charting is actually kind of challenging if you have an irregular cycle, if you have PCOS, but there are ways to do it even with those fertility health issues or concerns. I didn't mention before this HCG, because HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin, is the hormone that is produced when pregnancy occurs and implantation happens. This is the hormone that's detected by an at-home pregnancy test. It indicates whether you're pregnant or not. And that's not to be confused with HSG, or hysterosalpingogram, right? That's a big word, but that's the test to see if you have blockages in your fallopian tubes. So HCG is different from HSG. What else? And so depending upon how all the events of your menstrual cycle, from the first day of one period to the first day of the next go, you could either be pregnant or start all of these things all over again until midlife. In a woman's midlife, as she enters into her sometimes early, often mid to late 40s and early 50s, the natural progression of things is for the body, the female body, to prepare to become infertile. I know that that's not what a lot of women want to hear as we wait longer and longer to begin to think about starting our families and try to start families. We have women reach out to us at the Natural Fertility Shop and Natural Fertility Info all the time, who are older, who have waited for very valid reasons, who still want to try to conceive. And we want you to have hope, but we also need to be realistic and acknowledge that Mother Nature designed us to be infertile beings at some point in our life. Hopefully later if you're still wanting to have a baby. But in midlife, cycles do become irregular, and for a variety of reasons before that, cycles can become irregular. But now that we know there are many things that can interfere with the events of the menstrual cycle well before we begin the natural change. And we know that there's a lot that goes on in the menstrual cycle. It's much more intricate than I've made it here, to be honest. There are a lot more hormones involved. But anyway, this is in short, hopefully not too technical of a way to describe the menstrual cycle and to clarify what some of these terms mean that maybe you didn't know or aren't finding great, solid answers about. But this actually happens. The whole entire menstrual cycle actually happens every trip we make around the moon. And if you're curious about this, about lunar rhythms of the moon and how they play a role in the natural rhythm of the menstrual cycle, we have information on that for you. It's just really something I think is fascinating. So remember, your cycle is not your period. The cycle is an entire time frame. It's usually about a month. It's sometimes a little shorter, a little longer. You don't necessarily have to worry if that's the case and you have nothing else going on. But the entire cycle or menstrual cycle is from period day 1 to the next period day 1. Your period is a menstrual period or flow. Estrogen and progesterone are involved, obviously throughout the entire cycle, but there are 3 phases, follicular, ovulatory, and luteal phase. And it's in that ovulation, during that ovulatory phase or your fertile window ovulation, that you can actually try to conceive and hopefully conceive naturally if you want to. But ultimately remember that our goal here is to help you understand that there's a lot going on, that it's very important to understand all of these phases of your cycle. Your cycle is specific to you and unique to you, and that's fabulous and great. It should be. Mine is to me too, and so is Sarah's, and so is Molly's, and so is everyone else's. And that understanding the phases of your cycle, knowing when you ovulate, charting your basal body temperature and tracking for tracking your cervical mucus can all help you if you're trying to conceive and it's not happening. It can also help practitioners like the herbalists on our team that you reach out to help you understand if there's something going on that maybe needs to be addressed. And certainly help your doctor understand if there's a fertility health issue or be something he or she can take into consideration when you're working with them to determine if there's an issue. So anyway, bare bones about the menstrual cycle, and I hope that was helpful to anyone who wasn't quite clear. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for taking in my quick bare bones refresher of the menstrual cycle and letting me have my little soapbox moment about educating girls about how amazing our bodies are and what they can do for us. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you have a fabulous weekend, and we'll see you next week. All right, bye.